What you're about to see has never happened outside Buckingham Palace until now. Why did a royal guard ignore a direct salute from the son of a US president and then lower his eyes for a child instead? This moment nearly breached decades of royal protocol, right in front of hundreds of stunned tourists. Watch closely. Trump's son steps forward, hand raised, cameras rolling, and the guard doesn't flinch. But what happened seconds later left the entire forecourt in complete silence. Now, before we reveal the full story first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The late August air had that particular London stillness, warm enough for short sleeves, but thick with the kind of heavy quiet that builds before something unpleasant. Outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, tourists milled about with cameras ready and elbows out, angling for that perfect shot of the forecourt. Flags stirred lazily above the domed roof, and somewhere down the mall, a police horse gave a disgruntled snort. It was going to be a long day. Staff Sergeant Hugh Mercer didn't move, standing tall in full ceremonial uniform, his red tunic immaculate and pressed, white gloves loose at his sides, and the weight of his bearskin hat evenly distributed across a spine honed by 18 years of military service. Eyes didn't flicker, his breathing stayed measured. Even as a toddler screamed near the rope line, and a pack of teenagers dared each other to shout things they wouldn't say at home, he held the line. Discipline was the job, and Mercer had learned early that stillness had power, especially when it concealed strength. Behind the scenes, however, things were less composed. Two palace staffers passed hurried glances between themselves, murmuring under their breath about the American visitor. He wasn't part of a scheduled diplomatic event, nor a formal dignitary with state clearance, but he had sent a letter. Well, his team had, and the request had reached someone senior enough that a private walkabout was granted, provided it didn't interrupt ceremonial operations. It was only later, as the black convoy arrived through the side entrance, SUVs larger than most London flats, windows dark and glinting in the sun, that everyone realised who they were dealing with. Preston Trump, son of the former US president. Not a government official, not a diplomat, but the kind of name that made PR teams nervous and palace security twitchy. Known more for controversy than composure, Preston wasn't a man who understood the concept of discretion. He stepped out of the middle vehicle like he owned the gravel under his shoes, sunglasses on despite the cloud cover, sleeves rolled to the elbow of an expensive shirt that looked deliberately wrinkled. One hand held a phone mid-record. The other tossed a piece of gum into his mouth with performative casualness. "Well, would you look at that?" he drawled loudly enough for half the crowd to hear. "They really do stand like robots." The cameraman with him, a young man in branded trainers and a nervous smile, tried to keep up as Preston sauntered forward, ignoring the polite but firm suggestion from a steward to remain behind the rope line. "Come on, man," he said to the camera. "Let's see if Buckingham's finest know how to crack a grin." Mercer didn't blink. Not when Preston crossed the boundary line, not when he whistled a slow, sarcastic tune, not even when he leaned just a little too close and muttered, "Hope you speak English under all that fur." A junior palace guide in a navy blazer approached quickly, a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. "Sir, we'd appreciate it if you stayed on the designated public side. These guards are not to be approached during duty." Preston grinned at her without looking. "It's cool, I'm just saying hi, cultural exchange and all that." The guide opened her mouth to speak again, but another SUV door slammed shut and she hesitated. There were more of them, assistants, handlers, a personal security guy built like a fridge who stood back and watched it all unfold with the boredom of someone used to chaos. And Preston? He walked in a lazy arc around Mercer, inspecting him like a museum piece. "Bet you blink first," he said under his breath. $10 says I can get a salute." Behind the line, a few tourists had picked up on the spectacle. Phones came out. A small group of American visitors leaned in, chuckling nervously. One of them murmured, "Is he allowed to do that?" The other shrugged. "He's a Trump. They don't ask." Mercer remained still. His boots were rooted in gravel. His mind was not. Because Mercer wasn't just a ceremonial statue in a red coat. He was watching, listening. And even though he wouldn't say a word, not yet, something in the air had shifted. Because this wasn't a photo op. This wasn't his kingdom. And that meant rules would be tested. Preston Trump had that unmistakable energy of someone who believed the world was his waiting room, the kind who snapped fingers at waiters and smiled while doing it. He lingered near Mercer for a few more seconds, rocking on his heels like a child daring someone to stop him. "You know," he said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear, "in the US we salute our military. It's a sign of respect. You boys do that here, right? Or are you just mannequins in fancy hats?" The cameraman stifled a laugh. Palace staff winced. Mercer didn't flinch. His right hand remained at his side, white glove brushing the seam of his trousers. His rifle stayed grounded against his shoulder, unmoving. Preston turned to the camera with exaggerated amusement. "Bet I can make him move. Want to see?" From the rope line, a ripple of uncertainty passed through the tourists. Some found it entertaining. Others looked deeply uncomfortable. A little girl near the front, maybe 7 or 8, stood on tiptoe to whisper to her mother, "Why is that man being mean to the soldier?" The mother gently shushed her and pulled her a step back. Preston faced Mercer again. "Come on, man, I'm a guest. Give me a salute. A little respect for the next generation of leadership, huh?" He raised a hand to his brow in an exaggerated theatrical mock salute. "At ease, soldier." Mercer didn't acknowledge him. Not a blink, not a shift in stance. His eyes stared forward into the middle distance, fixed on a spot just past Preston's shoulder, as if he weren't even there. The cameraman whispered, "Maybe let's move on." But Preston wasn't interested in subtlety. He stepped forward, too close, and brought his fingers up to snap near Mercer's face. "Earth to Buckingham! You can stand down now. America's here." Before his fingers reached airspace, a sharp voice broke in. "Sir, please step back." It was the palace guide again, Miss Davison. She was no taller than his shoulder and half his weight, but her voice carried the brittle sharpness of someone dangerously close to the end of her patience. Preston turned toward her with mock offence. "You're interrupting a diplomatic moment. This is ceremonial ground," she said evenly. "You are interfering with a serving soldier, performing official duty. I must ask you to return behind the rope line." He dropped the smirk. "I'm a guest. I was invited. You were permitted a walkabout," she corrected. "Under agreed terms. You are now in breach of those." His jaw shifted slightly, enough to reveal that he wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Not without being asked for a donation afterward. He gestured to the crowd. "They're enjoying it." They weren't. Not really. Several tourists had put their phones down. A couple had left altogether. What remained was no longer amusement, it was tension. A few British visitors looked deeply embarrassed. A pair of older veterans stood near the rail, arms folded, silently unimpressed. Preston glanced toward his security detail, who remained stone-faced and unmoving. They weren't here to intervene unless someone pulled a weapon. And Mercer still didn't blink. With a heavy sigh of performative exhaustion, Preston turned back to the camera. "Okay, fine. Let's get this shot and move on." He stepped beside Mercer again, positioning himself directly beside the ceremonial post. "Let's do one for the people," he said brightly. "Palace power pose." He squared his shoulders, gave a cheesy grin, and threw an arm around the air just shy of Mercer's back, close enough to suggest a posed photo, but not quite touching. But even that act drew sharp breaths from some onlookers. Mercer didn't react. Not to the gesture, not to the crowd, not to the man whose entire persona relied on forcing others to respond. After holding the fake photo op for several seconds, Preston dropped the act. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "I've had TSA agents show more personality." Ms. Davison stepped closer. "This is not a performance, Mr. Trump. That man has stood in Helmand Province. That uniform carries memories older than your surname. You will show respect." Preston smirked again, but this time there was a flicker of unease behind his sunglasses. "Relax, lady, I just wanted a salute." "You are not entitled to one," she said simply. He looked back at Mercer. "Bet he salutes the king, right?" "Yes," she replied, "and sometimes, if you've earned it, he might salute you too." A long beat. The crowd was dead quiet. Preston turned away with a sarcastic chuckle. This country's lost its sense of humour. But nobody laughed with him. Mercer remained still, the sun bouncing off the gold buttons across his chest, his jaw locked in that familiar, unreadable expression of the guards. And as Preston walked off, diffused but not defeated, something in the air had shifted once again. Because the game hadn't worked, the button hadn't pushed, the reaction hadn't come. And that, more than any insult, was the first thing Preston Trump couldn't understand. The air outside Buckingham Palace had thickened, not from heat, but from something unspoken. A tension hung in the space where laughter used to be, as if the forecourt itself had drawn a breath and wasn't ready to exhale. Preston Trump, still smirking but now speaking more to his camera than the crowd, paced back toward the rope line, muttering comments for his followers. But whatever amusement he hoped to stir was gone. The crowd had turned. A middle-aged couple from Yorkshire stood near the front, their arms folded, expressions tight. The man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Little sod doesn't know where he is." Further down, a young girl tugged at her father's hand. "Daddy! Why's that man shouting at the soldier?" Her father crouched beside her. "Because some people don't understand that silence can be louder than noise." The palace staff hadn't moved. No alarms had been raised, but the mood had undeniably shifted. The kind of shift that couldn't be captured on film, but lived in the sideways glances and quiet murmurs shared between strangers. And at the centre of it all, Mercer remained a monolith, unmoving. Watching without seeming to watch, listening without reacting. But somewhere behind the wall of discipline, he was measuring the weight of the moment. The tourists weren't just watching him anymore, they were watching Preston. And that's when the line got crossed. Preston turned, caught off guard by the shift in attention. His charm flickered. Too many of the faces looking back at him now held something colder than curiosity, so he pushed. "Seriously, what's the big deal?" he said loudly. "It's a dude in a hat. You people act like this is sacred or something." A few gasps rippled through the group. Others narrowed their eyes. Ms. Davison took a step forward, but stopped short. This wasn't her moment anymore. Something else was happening now. Something older, something deeper than procedure or protocol. And Preston wasn't reading the room. He gestured toward Mercer again. "I mean, he doesn't even flinch. What are you guarding, bro? Ghosts." A man near the back, a veteran, judging by his gait, wide shoulders, and the medal pin on his blazer, shook his head with audible disgust. "He's guarding history," he muttered, "and you just trampled through it." Preston ignored the comment, too absorbed in narrating for his camera. "See, this is why America wins. Over there we respect our soldiers. Here, they just dress them up like toys." He mimed a march, swinging his arms cartoonishly before standing stiffly like a parody of Mercer. A few in the crowd looked away. One woman lowered her phone and switched it off. A child covered his ears, not from volume, but from shame he didn't know how to explain. Then came a quiet voice from the side. "Sir." The tone was low, even, calm, but different. Everyone turned. An elderly man had stepped forward from the cluster of tourists. He was tall, though slightly stooped, with a neat grey moustache and a walking cane carved from dark oak. He wore a pale blazer over a pressed shirt, a small silver emblem on his lapel, a military pin, faded but unmistakable. Preston didn't register him as a threat, just another Brit with a complaint. But the man wasn't addressing the palace staff or the crowd. He was speaking to Preston directly. I'd suggest you stop now. Preston raised his eyebrows. Excuse me. You're not in your country anymore. And this, the man gestured toward Mercer, isn't your stage. A few heads turned. The crowd was beginning to align itself, not with the cameras, but with something quieter, firmer. Preston gave a tight-lipped smile. Who are you? The manners police? The man didn't flinch. Colonel Alastair Grant, retired, Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, Falklands, Kosovo, Iraq. He let the silence speak for him. Preston hesitated, just for a beat. Colonel Grant stepped closer to the rope. His voice never rose, but it cut through the morning air like polished steel. That man salutes only the king, or a fallen brother, or a child who doesn't ask for it, not tourists, not cameras, and certainly not a boy who thinks status is the same thing as service. The crowd went still. Even Preston's videographer lowered the lens slightly. Miss Davison, standing behind the colonel, said nothing. She didn't have to. Preston opened his mouth, then closed it again. And in that moment, for the first time since he'd stepped onto the forecourt, he realized something he couldn't laugh off. He wasn't in control anymore. For a man who made his name off being the loudest voice in every room, Preston Trump suddenly found himself standing in silence he didn't know how to fill. Colonel Grant didn't move. He didn't need to. His cane remained planted at his side, his back straight despite age, his eyes focused with the quiet intensity of someone who'd long since earned the right to be listened to. Preston attempted to laugh it off, a weak chuckle that failed to catch on with anyone around him. So what? You're here to protect the guy in the hat? The colonel didn't even blink. I'm here to remind you that some uniforms deserve silence, not sarcasm. Few people in the crowd nodded. One man clapped once, not for performance, but in recognition. It didn't spread. It didn't need to. Preston rolled his eyes. You people take this seriously, huh? Colonel Grant's gaze sharpened. That guy in the hat has likely seen more in a year than you'll face in a lifetime. You think because he doesn't speak, he doesn't understand, because he doesn't move, he doesn't matter? Preston crossed his arms, defensive now. Look, I'm just saying it's weird, all right? A guy stands still for hours while people take selfies with him. It's a bit medieval. The colonel's voice remained calm. He stands still so others don't have to. That's what you're missing. No grand speech. No dramatic gesture. Just truth. And that, more than anything, seemed to unnerve Preston. He turned to the crowd, searching for someone, anyone, to laugh with him, to share in the absurdity. But all he found were quiet stares, children holding their parents' hands, veterans looking on with grim stillness. The tide had turned. Even his cameraman had lowered the lens completely, now clutching it awkwardly at his side, like a prop that had gone out of fashion. Preston scoffed and looked back at Colonel Grant. Is this your country's thing? Dressing up grief in red jackets and pretending it's tradition? The words should have landed with sting. Instead, they fell like stones into a lake, met only with depth and stillness. The colonel took one breath before speaking again. His uniform isn't grief. It's memory. It's his father's voice, his brother's footsteps, the names he'll never say out loud again. And he wears it with a kind of strength you wouldn't recognize if it saluted you to your face. A pause. He's not here to impress you. He's here to protect something bigger than both of us. And he does it quietly, because dignity doesn't shout. Somewhere behind them, a pigeon flapped lazily against the roof, guttering. A breeze moved through the forecourt, brushing past the rows of silent guards as if reluctant to interrupt them. Preston turned, frustrated now, muttering to his assistant. This is insane. I didn't come here for a lecture. Colonel Grant nodded once. Number you came here for attention, but you stumbled into a tradition older than your entitlement, and it didn't blink. Miss Davison stepped forward then, voice gentle but firm. Mr. Trump, I think it's time we continued your tour. If you'd like to see the West Terrace garden, our liaison officer is waiting. Preston hesitated, then shrugged with a forced grin. "Sure, let's get out of this little theatre." As he stepped away, she added softly, "This isn't theatre. It's ceremony. There's a difference. One asks for applause, the other remembers the cost." Preston didn't respond. He walked off, muttering under his breath about people taking things too seriously. But behind him, something remarkable happened. A small boy, perhaps 6 or 7, stepped away from the crowd, clutching a tiny Union Jack in his fist. He approached the rope line slowly, eyes fixed on Mercer, who hadn't moved an inch. And then, with a sincerity only children possess, the boy raised his right hand in a salute. Not perfect. His angle was off, fingers loose, but it was earnest, honest. The crowd held its breath. Mercer, still motionless, didn't break discipline, but just for a moment his eyes lowered, met the boys, held them for a single heartbeat, then returned to the horizon. The boy smiled wide. His father pulled him back gently, whispered something and tousled his hair. Preston had missed it entirely, but everyone else saw, because that day the only salute given wasn't to power or wealth or fame. It was to a boy who understood more about respect than a man 3 times his age. And the guard had noticed. Preston Trump hadn't stormed off exactly, but his exit carried all the wounded energy of a man who'd been outplayed without realizing it until the end. He muttered something to his assistant about editing the good bits later, then disappeared through a side gate, flanked by polite but unsmiling palace staff. The cameraman, trailing behind, glanced back once toward the crowd, then to the motionless guard he'd just spent 10 minutes trying to provoke on cue. The lens stayed capped, but the crowd remained. They didn't leave, they didn't disperse. No one clapped or cheered. They just stood, watching, waiting for something they couldn't quite define. At the rope line, the young boy with the Union Jack was back at his father's side, still beaming. His salute had been returned, not by a gesture, but by something deeper. He didn't have the language for it, but he understood what had happened, the way only children and soldiers seem to. "Did he see me?" the boy asked. His father knelt beside him, voice soft. "He saw you, lad." And he answered. Behind them, a woman wiped her eyes discreetly with the sleeve of her cardigan. Her husband put a hand on her back without saying a word. Closer to the guard's post, the retired colonel remained where he stood. He didn't speak again, didn't need to. He simply nodded once at Mercer, a small, deliberate gesture from one man of service to another. Mercer did not nod in return. But his eyes shifted again, fractional, exacting, acknowledging the gesture without breaking discipline. It was enough. The moment hung in the air, not because of anything that was said, but because of everything that wasn't. Across the forecourt, Miss Davison approached the main palace door, walking slowly as if unwilling to disrupt the stillness. Before disappearing behind the ornate arch, she turned back and looked across the crowd, not at Preston, who was long gone, but at the people who had stayed. Some were already whispering among themselves, not gossiping, but reflecting. A man who'd been live-streaming earlier now stood with his phone at his side, screen locked. He didn't need to post what he'd filmed. It didn't belong online. This wasn't a moment for virality. It was a moment for memory. And Mercer? He stood exactly as he had at the beginning. No shift in stance, no change in breath, no fanfare or flourish. Only stillness, the kind that came not from apathy but from command, from purpose. And the crowd finally understood what that stillness meant. It wasn't silence, it was containment. It was strength that didn't need to declare itself. Service that didn't seek credit. Respect that didn't waver, even under insult. A voice rose quietly from the rope line, an older woman with a Scottish accent, speaking softly to her daughter. That lad didn't blink for a president's son, but he blinked for a child. That tells you everything. And so the victory wasn't in a witty retort, or a confrontation, or a viral mic drop. It was in the refusal to perform. It was in the boy's salute. It was in Mercer's eyes dropping just once. Preston had left with a camera full of footage and no understanding of what he'd missed. But the others? The ones who stayed, they would carry the moment for the rest of their lives. A story not told in headlines, but in hushed retellings over dinner tables and taxi rides and chance conversations. Did you hear what happened outside the palace that day? Yeah, the Trump kid tried to make a guard salute him. Did he? No. Then what happened? He saluted someone else instead. And that would be enough. The convoy was long gone. Whatever diplomatic walkabout had been arranged, it concluded early and without ceremony. A steward at the West Garden later said the guest lost interest quickly. There were no photos with officials, no closing statements, just a quiet, hasty departure out the side gate. But on the forecourt, the silence lingered. Eventually, the changing of the guard resumed like clockwork. Tourists shuffled back into formation behind their phones. A few guards rotated posts with the same precise choreography performed for centuries. But something had shifted. You could feel it in the way the crowd gave the guards a wider berth than before. In how even the loudest teenagers now whispered. In how every child who stood at the rope line looked not for a reaction, but to understand. By early afternoon, the sun had warmed the stone beneath Mercer's boots. When the next rotation came, he finally broke posture, measured steps, slow turn, silent pivot toward the arch. The other guard took his place with synchronized ease, and Mercer disappeared into the shaded corridor where ceremony gave way to breath. Inside the barracks, he removed his bearskin with practiced precision, smoothing the edge before setting it gently on its peg. His red tunic came off next, exposing the sweat-darkened shirt beneath. A long breath left his lungs, not tired, just released. Across the room, another guardsman, Private Lennox, watched him in silence. After a moment he spoke. "So that was the Trump kid, yeah?" Mercer nodded once. "What a piece of work." Mercer didn't reply. Lennox leaned against the locker. "Never seen a crowd go that still without a single order. Whatever that was, it wasn't normal." Mercer adjusted his cuffs. But it was telling." Lennox cocked his head. "You didn't flinch, not once." "I wasn't meant to." "And the boy?" Mercer looked over, just for a moment. "He was watching, that's who it was for." Lennox gave a soft chuckle. Not mocking, more in admiration. "Bet the cameras missed that." "Good," Mercer said. They fell into silence again, the kind that didn't require filling. Just men who understood what it meant to stand still for something. Outside, a palace steward relayed a quiet observation to another staffer. He tried to provoke the guard for a reaction, but the only one who got a moment was a boy who didn't even ask. The video Preston had recorded never made headlines. It was uploaded. Comments had turned against him before the algorithm even picked it up. But another video, taken from a phone, held steady by a woman near the rope, circulated quietly. It showed a child raising a salute and a soldier lowering his eyes. Its caption read, "He didn't flinch for a billionaire's son, but lowered his eyes for a child." And that was the story that stayed. If you'd been standing in that crowd, would you have spoken up like the colonel, or stayed quiet? Do you think a salute still means something, even when it's never given? Here's the big one. Who really earned respect that day? The man who demanded it, or the one who never asked? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this story reminded you that dignity can speak louder than power, give it a like and tap that subscribe button. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss one of our daily Royal Guard stories. And if you know someone who still thinks these guards are just for show, share this video with them. It might just change how they see things. More true-feeling stories are waiting for you on your screen. Go watch them next, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another one that proves it. Real strength doesn't demand attention. It just stands.